Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with this weird little read along, this weird little read through that I'm doing with David Wiley and Tony from An Erudite Adventure of Lord of the Rings, but in an unconventional way. We are starting with the Two Towers. We're starting in the middle of Tolkien's book instead of at the beginning with the Fellowship of the Ring. I had never done this before. I've read this book more times than I can count, but always from front to back. Uh, and often when front to back, skipping chunks that I had read before and not particularly liked, because Tolkien takes a huge narrative gamble in The Two Towers. He he splits the action completely. No characters in between, no flitting back and forth. He splits the action completely, and as I've demonstrated, rhetorically also is writing a very different book. It doesn't even sound the same. The first half of The Two Towers is our main epic fantasy heroes, Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and Gandalf the Wizard, and battles on the open plain and in strongholds. And then the book stops completely. We stop in the middle of their action and move to a far smaller scale storyline where the Hobbit Frodo and his servant Sam, eh, accompanied by the creature Gollum, are walking into Mordor, the stronghold of Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, in order to take the one ring of power, the ring that Sauron forged, and it has a huge amount of his energy in it, to the fires of Mount Doom and destroy it. Gollum doesn't know that that's the mission, or he very much would not put up with it. He is thinking, well, at least at the beginning, on one level, he's perhaps thinking, as his own speech indicates, that maybe if he's really, really good, if he's really, really nice to these two hobbitses, they'll give him back his precious. They'll give him back the ring that he lost when Bilbo Baggins stole it from him 70 years ago. Uh, Even though, as I mentioned, we saw in an earlier chapter, Frodo tells him explicitly, in the hardest possible terms, you will never get it back. That is not going to happen. So Gollum has been told by the current bearer of the ring that he's never even going to touch his precious again. Now, that's not exactly true. Readers of the book know that he is going to touch precious one more time before he dies. But as a threat, it's enough to keep him in line, and he is also a guide. He has been this way before. He has been to Mordor and back before. One of the very few people who can say that. He says that he escaped from Mordor after being tortured and telling Sauron's operatives everything he knows about the Shire and hobbits and the One Ring. It's largely through the torture of Gollum that Sauron understands that his ring is, at long last, after millennia, found again, that it's in someone's possession. It stands to reason from what we've been told that Sauron probably wasn't even aware that hobbits existed. Now he knows all about that, has a rough idea of what's going on, and it's hurrying his plans for war against the West, for war against the kingdom, the great southern kingdom of Gondor, which, unlike the kingdom of Rohan that we have seen, Gondor has no king. The king of Gondor is the heir of Elendil. It's the heir of Isildur, which is a line that has been suppressed and missing for all that time since the ring was last known. It was the founder of that line who cut the ring from Sauron's finger and decided to keep it for himself. And as long as the ring has been missing, that line has been unknown to everyone else in the West except at Rivendell, except to Elrond. Uh, Instead, Gondor has a steward. His chair is set down below the throne of the king. He is just the steward. He is just looking after things until the king returns. But by this point, it's been so long that a lot of the people in Gondor probably think the king's returning is a myth. In the chapter that we're reading today, is called The Window on the West. And in this chapter, we're told that Boromir was one of those people. He thought, how long are we supposed to leave the throne empty before we decide the king is not coming back and make a king for our own? Frodo and Sam and Gollum are wandering around in the wilderness. They cross the Emyn Muil, they cross the Dead Marshes, they cross a desert. They get to Mordor, and it is impregnable, obviously. It's impregnable, so they can't go in by the front door. But Gollum knows a way. He knows a byway. They take that byway and unexpectedly encounter not only greenery and a lush, living, spring-like world, which we saw last time, but also warriors of Gondor who are up in this area to hunt the enemy, to hunt either orcs or Haradrim, the men of the east who are under Sauron's sway, or both. And the last chapter that we read, yesterday's chapter, ends with one of those combats. It's mostly off stage, and then the good guys are victorious. Faramir and his men are victorious. And our new chapter, The Window on the West, starts with Faramir questioning Frodo. Faramir and his men have already met Frodo and Sam. They have not met Gollum. Gollum fled, and he is very good at staying hidden. He's very good at avoiding big people, at avoiding men. He's been doing it for a very long time, and just as well, because he's a surprisingly strong and resourceful creature, but scrawny. If the men of Gondor decided to fill him full of arrows, well, he doesn't want that to happen. So he vanishes once they come on the scene. But these men of Gondor have already talked with Frodo and Sam just a bit. They are led by a man named Faramir. And it becomes obvious in these chapters that Faramir isn't just a leader of men from the Kingdom of Gondor. He is the brother of Boromir, who was a member of the Fellowship of the Ring that set out from Rivendell with the ring originally. Frodo knew Boromir and didn't like what he saw. Boromir not only was impatient with the idea of kings returning to Gondor, he was also impatient with the idea of walking the One Ring to Mordor in order to destroy it. To him, that makes no sense. All the wise and old people here are telling you that this is an awe-inspiring weapon. Surely it's come into our hands specifically for the purpose of using it against its maker. Boromir is told over and over again, no, the ring is thoroughly evil. It answers to one master only. It cannot be used for good. And he seems to begrudgingly agree to that, but it becomes too much to him. The temptation becomes too much for him, and he tries to take the ring from Frodo by force. Frodo has to flee from him with Sam. And before Boromir can make it right, he dies in defense of two other hobbits, Merry and Pippin, who we saw in the first part of the book and are not in this part of the book. We saw as the Two Towers began that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, who are all that are left of the Fellowship when we meet them, they don't have the time or the equipment or the material to make a burial mound for Boromir. So they clean him. They get the smudge and dirt and blood of orc wounds off him. They comb his hair. And they lay him out with the wounds and with the treasures and the armories of his enemies in one of the boats they took from Lothlorien, from Galadriel in Lothlorien, and send it on its way down the river and over the falls of Rhoros. Kind of trusting in a kind of folkloric way, in a metaphorical way, we think that the river will take care of Boromir. It will not allow any harm to come to him. And that's the last we see. Our heroes are off right away to chase the band of orcs that kidnapped Merry and Pippin, and that's how the story progresses. Now we come to A Window on the West, when Frodo and Sam are meeting Faramir, who has set out from Gondor, and they aren't enemies, but Faramir knows, we're told about Faramir that he is not only tall and golden, but also quick-witted. We are never told that about Boromir, his brother. We're told that about Faramir, that he is quick-witted, and it reminds us of stories that we have already heard alluded to, of the preternatural abilities of some of the purer bloodlines of men in Gondor. They tend to live a very long time. They tend to have an aptitude for visions and perceiving the thoughts and realities of other people, even when their guard is up. Faramir's father has this quality in an extreme degree. Boromir appeared not to have it at all. In the chapter, The Window on the West, Faramir talks about the difference between the people of Rohan and the people of Gondor. The Gondor, of course, is allied with Rohan and is very fond of the Rohirrim. But Faramir tells us what we've already heard about them, which is that they are much like men of olden days. They are like children. They write no books, but they sing songs. They are simple and valorous and place a great deal of value in deeds of arms, in strength and war. As Faramir puts it, they view those things as good things in and of themselves. And from a comment like that, we can easily see that the men of Gondor were at one point, before they began to decline, far more than that, far more subtle than that. Still terrible in war, but not seeing war as an end in itself. More sophisticated. as a people. We get the strong impression that they're not all like that. Boromir wasn't like that, but Faramir seems very much to be like that. And as this chapter opens, Faramir is, now that their fight with the Haradrim is over, Faramir has time to sit down, a little time, to sit down with Frodo and ask him some pointed questions. What are you doing here? You've already given me assurances enough so that I know you're not simply working for the enemy, who we do not name. But what are you? What is going on here? It's obvious to Faramir that this is a very, very important meeting. Not a random thing, not useless strangers. These people knew his brother. Something is going on here. And he wants to get to the bottom of it, and he is an extremely shrewd questioner in a way that his brother was not. Faramir, at one point, when they're dodging back and forth with their questions, both in the first questioning and later when Faramir can talk to Frodo alone, and tells him, the understatement of the century tells him, you haven't been entirely frank with me. Yeah, well, Frodo has already, keep in mind, experienced what the temptation of the ring can be like, the horror of it. And although he has Sting, his Westerness forged sword, he's just a little hobbit. He's just an ordinary person. So he has to have his guard up around big warrior men, especially if this ring can turn their minds, the way it did Boromir's. And this is Boromir's brother. So Frodo's guard is up. He tells Faramir, I've told you as much as I can. I am no friend of the enemy, and if you're no friend of him, you shouldn't hinder me. I have an errand of my own. It doesn't involve you, but I can't tell you any more than what I already have, which we gather isn't all that much. But even from that much, Faramir has that preternatural Númenórean insight and can already figure things out a lot. Right at the beginning, when he's been told almost nothing, he says this, what in truth this thing, with a capital T, is, I cannot yet guess, but some heirloom or power and peril it must be, a fell weapon perchance, devised by the Dark Lord. If it were a thing that gave great advantage in battle, I can well believe that Boromir, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the victory of Minas Tirith and his own glory therein. That's in parentheses, but that's Faramir commenting all along the way, just offhandedly, that his brother wasn't solely concerned with the glory of Minas Tirith, that he was also concerned with his own glory. That I can well imagine he might desire a thing and be allured by it. Alas, that ever he went on that errand. I should have been chosen by my father and the elders, but he put himself forward as being the older and the hardier, both true. And he would not be stayed. That is really fascinating, because not only it gives us a great insight into Faramir. Faramir being very, very different from Boromir. He's willing to comment even on his beloved brother's nature, that it wasn't pure, that he had his own honor meant a lot to him. Worth parenthetical mention, right on the same line as the honor of Minas Tirith. And he also just offhandedly mentions that his brother was tougher than he is, which we also can't imagine Boromir doing. Faramir also gives Frodo a much clearer view of how things stand in Gondor, and how Gondor is waning, how its strength is waning. He calls it a springless autumn. He doesn't see any hope for things, for the future. And he talks about a vision that he had of Boromir in his boat, his Lothlorien boat, floating by, surrounded by a glowing nimbus, cleaned and well tended, but dead. And then he flows away as a vision. And that's when this chapter is Tolkien playing around with the kind of narrative hijinks that he loves to indulge in. And he's very, very good at it. It even crops up in the Silmarillion. He's very, very good at it. Because think about what this chapter means. Think about the knowledge deficits that are going on in this chapter. There are 3 different levels of knowledge in this chapter, and Tolkien navigates them all perfectly. Frodo doesn't know that Boromir is dead, right? He flees Boromir. He has no idea that Boromir has been killed. He doesn't know anything about the rest of the Fellowship after that moment. Faramir not only doesn't know why Boromir fell out with Frodo, he's starting to guess what the reason is. When he uses that word allured, he's starting to guess what the reason is. It's incredible how insightful he is, much like his father. But Faramir doesn't know that Gandalf is dead. much less that Gandalf has come back alive. Frodo knows that Gandalf has died, apparently, in Moria, fighting the Balrog, but has no idea that Gandalf has returned. And we, the reader, know both of those things. So it's wonderful, wonderful different steps and layers of knowledge that these characters have to piece together amongst themselves. Once Frodo learns that Faramir is sincere in saying that Boromir is dead, that vision, Frodo naturally thinks, well, then maybe all my friends are dead. maybe Sam and I are the last members of this fellowship. How horrible, how horrifying to think of and not to know. It's Faramir who has to calm him down and say, well, I know that my vision was accurate. And if my vision was accurate, well, orcs and servants of Sauron or Saruman would not have dressed Boromir in his finest. They would not have cared to send him on his way down the Falls of Rorus. So some of your fellowship had to still be alive when that happened. And Faramir also tells Frodo about some of the lessening of Gondor, some of the degeneration of the great men of the West. Not the Rohirrim, but the men of Gondor. And by extension, the long line from Numenor. The lessening of them. It's a little bit disquieting as a note that crops up in Tolkien over and over again, how they bred with lesser peoples and so became lesser themselves. But Faramir paints a picture that is just lovely. It's, again, Tolkien really working in a great rhetorical registry, something that I thought was completely missing from these chapters. He writes here that the older folk of Gondor in ages past became obsessed with immortality, much like the Númenóreans had been before them. They had all the terrestrial power that they had, but they still had limited lifespan. And he writes, there's just a great vignette that he puts in here. Childless lords sat in aged halls musing on heraldry. In secret chambers, withered men compounded strong elixirs, or in high, cold towers asked questions of the stars. That is just lovely. That is absolutely fantastic stuff. And it's sections like that, little bits and pieces like that. Let's read that again. Childless lords sat in aged halls musing on heraldry. In secret chambers, withered men compounded strong elixirs, or in high, cold towers asked questions of the stars. I mentioned earlier that I thought that one passage that I read very much seemed to read like pulp fiction, like Robert E. Howard and his companions, and that I found it hard to believe that an echo like that could exist in Tolkien accidentally. This line, and a few lines like it, there aren't many in Tolkien that read like this, that much compression of intense, crystalline imagery, that happens over and over again in Lord Dunsany. Can't help but think that there's a little bit of influence here going on, but it's wonderful either way. And a big part of what convinces Faramir, he's pretty convinced anyway, he's pretty comfortable in his own instincts, but a big part of what convinces him that all this must be true is that he's gotten a clear look at that ghostly image of that ship from Lothlorien and all of the gear piled all around his dead brother. And he can see that the elven brooches and the elven cloaks and whatnot that Frodo and Sam are wearing are the same gear. The story checks out, in other words. It's obvious that these two went to Lothlorien. It's obvious that they went there with Boromir, and that they were all outfitted at the same time in the same place. And when Lothlorien comes up, we naturally get talk of Galadriel. I'm not going to go on a rant here about Amazon's The Rings of Power. I'm not going to do that. But there is a wonderful parallel here, a wonderful echo of the first half of the Two Towers. In the first half of the Two Towers, in the chapter where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli meet the Riders of Rohan, they meet Éomer and his band, we learn that in the Kingdom of Rohan, in the south, Lorien and the Lady of Lorien, the Undying Lady of Lorien, are the subject of a kind of dark folklore. When Gimli first meets Éomer, Éomer thinks that it's a death sentence to meet the Lady of the Wood, that anyone who goes into Lothlorien is cursed. He has no idea what he's talking about, and Gimli issues a stout challenge to him. And there's a parallel here, because Faramir is likewise leery, not quite so hidebound as Éomer, but he's likewise leery about the idea that you were in Lothlorien and lived to tell about it, that you've encountered these wonders that I know only in stories. And Sam goes on at great length, much as Gimli does, about Galadriel, talking about her in a halting kind of worshipful way. And Faramir summarizes by saying she must be lovely indeed, perilously fair. And even that is too much for Sam. He says, I don't know about perilous. It strikes me that folks take their peril with them into Lorien and finds it there because they've brought it. But perhaps you could call her perilous because she's so strong in herself. You could dash yourself to pieces on her like a ship on a rock, or drown yourself like a hobbit in a river. But neither rock nor river would be to blame. And then he starts to say, now, because he knows as well as anybody that it was in Lothlorien that Boromir's peril was seen most clearly. He was deeply, deeply disturbed when Lady Galadriel probes his mind. Deeply disturbed. We are told by Gandalf. Gandalf tells us that Galadriel told him that Boromir was in peril. And Faramir's all over that. He catches it right away. He only needs very little to clue him in to what's going on here. To clue him into the real story, the story that Frodo isn't telling him. And we'll close out the discussion of this chapter with a question mark that I have, as usual. I'm reading these chapters almost for the first time. In fact, at one point, Faramir says to Frodo and Sam, "You are a new people and a new world to me." I almost feel that way about these Hobbit chapters. I have never given them this kind of serious consideration before, and I'm really enjoying that I am. But something happens at the end of this chapter, and I still don't know, even after all the times I've read it, whether it is Faramir having a joke, or whether it is meant to parallel, again, earlier chapters in The Lord of the Rings, specifically the Mirror of Galadriel, where Frodo tempts Galadriel with the One Ring, and she goes into a famous speech about what it would be like if she took the ring, seems almost on the edge of being legitimately tempted, and then controls herself and lets it go. Even if it means the end of everything she loves, she lets it go. Faramir has the exact same kind of moment. Sam accidentally spills that Boromir wanted the ring, that's this heirloom, this talisman of the Dark Lord is a ring. It's the one ring of power. That is Isildur's Bane. He accidentally spills that because he's kind of a nitwit. And Frodo is horrified that he would say that. And Sam says to him, let's see here. "Now look here, sir," talking to Faramir. "Don't you go taking advantage of my master because his servant's no better than a fool. You've spoken very handsome all along, put me off my guard, talking of elves and all. But handsome is as handsome does, we say. Now's a chance to show your quality. Now you know what we're talking about. You know that on the person of this hobbit is Isildur's Bane. This thing out of myth and legend. This thing that Gondor, at least reflexively, thinks would be the cure to their besieged state before the might of Mordor." And Faramir's response is fascinating. He says, "So it seems," said Faramir, slowly and very softly, with a strange smile. "So that is the answer to all the riddles. The one ring that was thought to have perished from the world, and Boromir tried to take it by force, and you escaped and ran all the way to me. And here in the wild I have you, 2 halflings and a host of men at my call, and the ring of rings, a pretty stroke of fortune, a chance for Faramir, captain of Gondor, to show his quality. Ha ha!" And he stands up. He stood up, very tall and stern, and his gray eyes glinting. Naturally, Frodo and Sam are horrified. They're horrified. They think they're seeing it happen again. We're told Frodo and Sam sprang from their stools and set themselves side by side with their backs to the wall, fumbling for their sword hilts. There was silence. All the men in the cave stopped talking and looked toward them in wonder. But Faramir sat down again in his chair and began to laugh quietly, and then suddenly became grave again. And then he jokes and says, he feels extra sorry for Boromir. What a trial it must have been to know that this thing was just within reach. But I'm not like that. He doesn't even say what Galadriel says. He doesn't say that he's conquering a temptation. He says that he's just not made to feel it. Which makes me wonder why he would do that. Or why he would pantomime that he was suddenly going over to the temptation of the ring. Why would he do that? Why would he terrify his guests like that? He had to know the effect it would have on them. And he does it anyway. see, it intentionally tries to sound somewhat menacing. I really understand that. I think there are levels to Faramir that I don't really appreciate, since I'm really indulging in this read for the first time in this kind of depth. But I like what I see. I like what I see. It's not dumb like Boromir. It is still valiant, but it's thoughtful. It's kind of like a good version of Denethor, who we're going to meet. But that is the end of this chapter. Uh, this is this little hiding place that Faramir has that he won't even let Sam and Frodo see. They're blindfolded as they go to it. It's not a place where they can stay. It's a place where they can be comfortable for the night. They can have some food and some rest, but they can't stay there. There's work to be done. They don't want to be found. So this is not a permanent resting place, but this is where the chapter ends. So we're gonna move on next time. I will try to make tomorrow's discussion a little shorter. I love talking about this book, and I had no idea I would ever love talking about these chapters quite as much, but I do. We'll move on next time. Next chapter is pretty creepy, and they just get creepier from here on out for the rest of the Two Towers. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.